So welcome
Yes.
everybody to CLS, to the Classical Liberal Seminar. Today it's my pleasure to introduce Victor Davis Hansen, who is the Hoover Institution's Martin and Illy Anderson Senior Fellow. Victor is a classicist. He is the author of hundreds of articles on Greek, agrarian, and military history. He has written close to 30 books. Beyond his scholarly work, Victor is a public intellectual and a very active political and cultural commentator. One of the many qualities I admire in Victor is his reputation as a campus heretic, consistently willing to articulate positions deemed taboo by the prevailing campus orthodoxy, including, of course, his case for Trump. So today he joins us to discuss his latest book, The Dying Citizen. Welcome, Victor.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to talk to you. I thought I would speak for about 25 minutes on citizenship. I wrote a book on more on the historical side, the end of everything, about why civilizations are annihilated in war. And that's not usual, but I thought this might be more timely given the election, why citizenship is dying. And I think just as a preamble, forget the politics of the election on Tuesday, but it does seem that in American political history that the side that can appeal most or can be perceived most addressing issues that pertain to the welfare of the middle class, upward mobility, win. I know that when the Republican Party during the McCain-Romney years was caricatured as not sensitive to the wishes of the middle class, then they lost. And then that was as true of the same thing with the McGovern-Carter years. And then there was a reaction with Reagan. And what we saw on Tuesday was a perception that the opposition had an agenda that was more of a boutique agenda. In other words, it didn't address some of the needs of the middle class. And when either party is successful, they tend to double down on their base or their emotional issues and forget what got them elected, which brings up why we're in political turmoil. And I thought what I'd do is look at about 6 or 7 things historically that created the middle class and are essential to citizenship and why they're in question now. I think everybody realizes that if you read classical history, one of the great signs of civilization was a move away from tribalism. And the introduction to Thucydides' history says, in earlier times, people were migratory and they identified by tribe. And if you read Solon, about Solon the lawgiver, that was a great contribution of Athenian democracy, that people gave up their primary affiliation of people who were in their neighborhood or related to them, their clan or their tribe, to a larger commonwealth. And that was kind of what the ideal of the melting pot was versus the salad bowl. In other words, and that was the dream of Martin Luther King, that would be we would pledge our allegiance to the content of our character, not the color of our skin. But I think the paradigm has been lost. The paradigm was this, that we like people coming from different cultures, different races, different religions to adorn the body politic in terms of fashion, food, music, cultural aspects, but we don't tamper with the core as outlined in the Constitution and the amendment process. In other words, we're a meritocratic society, we're a constitutional society. We have, after a long struggle, civil rights legislation that protects the integrity of the system and not tribalism. But over the last 20 years, I think we've evolved to where people are beginning to identify and self-segregate by their superficial appearance. Birds of a feather flock together. That term actually comes from Plato's Laws, where Socrates says, well, all old people only like to be with old people, and they're like birds of different species that only congregate. And it tends to be one of the most controversial of all anti-citizenship developments that people now will identify. In the most extreme and ridiculous cases, you have people like a Ward Churchill or Elizabeth Warren that try to suggest that they're Native American and high cheekbones or beads. But there is a perception that if you emphasize your tribal affiliation, then you will get government or private benefits. And in the past, when there was institutionalized racism, say in the Confederate South, if we had something called the 1/16 drop rule. I was noticing a high-profile case in Hollywood not long ago where a person claimed in an interracial marriage that the children should go to her because she was invoking the 1/16 rule, that the child in question was 1/8 Black, and if it was more than 1/16, she had a better claim to parenthood. But in general, this idea of racial essence or purity is antithetical to a pluralistic society. And just because in the past we erred on the side, there was institutionalized racism, I don't think the cure of it is repertory racism. And that's what, we don't use that word, but it's basically judging a person by their superficial appearance. And one of the things we saw in the election, whether it's genuine or contrived, is there's a effort. I never thought, as a person who grew up in a Democratic family, that the Republican Party would try to substitute class solidarity for racial essentialism. But when you saw the record number of minorities that were voting alongside the middle class, whatever you think of the particular politics, there was a sense that maybe, just maybe, people's tribal affiliation will not be accentuated. It's very important because historically, large countries that are constitutional, and if they tend to accentuate racial categories or caste, and you can see that in India, it's a large democracy. So is Brazil. Those are the only two large multiracial democracies, I think, maybe Indonesia. And when they do that, they don't function as well as the United States. And one reason I think we function pretty well is, at least traditionally, we did believe in the melting pot, and that after 2 or 3 generations, it was kind of irrelevant, or we really didn't know what anybody was. I think, so that's something to watch when you have a retribalization of a society. It's anti-citizenship. Another thing is important is the primacy of the middle class. And in Greece, we had this term for it called the mesoi, the middle people. In Marxist binary, sometimes it's dismissed, but if you have a viable middle class in the majority of the people, there's a lot of classical and Renaissance Enlightenment literature that explains why the middle class is important. And it comes down to that, unlike the poor, they're not dependent on government or wealthy individuals, and therefore they have what the Greeks called autonomia, autarkeia, an economic or political self-sufficiency, and they don't become clients of wealthy individuals or of the government, and therefore they're free thinkers. They're very important. They don't go and involve themselves in politics too much. They have to be economically self-sufficient to be politically free. And unlike the wealthy, they don't have the ability to influence government, backdoor deals, insiders, special concessions. So just in a practical sense, it's good to have as large a middle class as you can. Unfortunately, if you look at barometers of middle class viability, before 2017, they had not had a gain in income in 12 years. It went up a little bit before COVID. And you can start to see it in indicators of government dependency of the middle class. We had $1.8 trillion in student loans that's still out on the books. The average age of marriage in America has gone from about 25 to 29. The age of children, first child, has gone from 27 to 30. As recent as about 1998, I think we had about 2.0, 2.1 fertility rate. It's down to European levels, about 1.6. And the average American dies with $10,000 in credit debt and with negative net worth. And so that was an issue in this last campaign. Which side could better convince the other that it had incentives to create and empower the middle class, and that every good thing comes from that. Politically, you have a stable, common sense check on the wealthy and check on the poor as well. And there's not a glorification of the poor as sometimes happens. And sometimes you see in history this strange medievalism of a two-class society where the wealthy then have skip over a dwindling or are skeptical of the middle class, almost as if they're in the attic and they want the trap door to be shut. No one can come up and join them. And they form allegiances with poor people on the idea they will subsidize them or patronize them or keep them poor. But the middle class historically has been a threat to the wealthy above all. That's something to keep our eye on, as well as the retribalization. Those are traditional enemies of successful citizenship.
Victor, can I ask a clarification question, or should I wait?
Yes. Yeah.
When you said the average American dies with 10,000 in credit card debt, is that the average literally or the median?
The mean, I'm sorry, the mean. Yeah.
It's the mean, not the median. Okay,
yeah.
good.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah. And then the other question you have to be very careful historically when you conflate residency with citizenship. We used to be able to identify why a person would want to be a citizen. There were particular rights and responsibilities that were exclusive to them. Those are mostly vanished. There are about 6 or 7 things that, say, 50 years ago, a citizen enjoyed exclusively. One of them was the right to vote, of course. As you know, in school board elections in Berkeley, Cambridge, Massachusetts, people who are not citizens are voting. There's a lot of initiatives to allow non-citizens to vote. Another issue was non-citizens neither could hold political office nor could they participate in a campaign. Christopher Steele, for example, was on the payroll of the DNC, just to take one example. He was a British subject, very involved in the 2016 campaign. We have people for both parties from Europe that come over and want to enlist in campaigning activities for either the left or the right, even though that's supposedly against the law. Only citizens can do that. Another exclusivity of citizens is they used to be, for a brief period, only people in the military. Now we of course, you don't have to be a citizen to be in the military. You have to be a citizen to go back and forth across a border. You are given a passport. Maybe with Canada and Mexico, there's some kind of relaxation. I was reminded of me, I flew home from France after leading a tour this summer, and a person on the plane did not have their passport. I guess they lost it somewhere, and he said he lost it in the seat of his plane. And immediately, he was ahead of me. They ushered him into another room. And when I left, he was still in that room. In other words, they were trying to devise some way of verifying that he had a passport. But when you have 12 million people coming across the border without a passport, without a background check, and going back and forth, then you've really destroyed the idea that only citizens have this right to choose when they're going to leave and come into a country, which is important. We have a program with A1 immigration where you can get an app and come in the United States. And as you know, some programs are flying people in from different countries without passport control and without legal background checks. And that's happening for example, at the Fresno airport. I came in on a delayed flight, and there must be 700 or 800 people arriving each night on 4 or 5 flights from Mexico. And that's a special program that the administration has used that kind of bypasses the idea that you have to have a visa or a passport or a green card. We've never been in this situation either, where a state like California has 27% of the population that was not born in the United States. That can be very good if they're legal and they have a green card, but if a large percentage is not, then the process of integration, assimilation, intermarriage is kind of slowed down. We also we're in a great experiment, kind of nonchalantly. We have now 16% of the population, which is about 55 million people, were not born in the United States of various statuses. a large majority, the majority of them are here under illegal auspices. We've never done that before. So the process of assimilating people who come in mass it's very difficult to do. Generally, immigration worked in the United States because, except for periods of a decade or two with the Irish or the Italians or Eastern Europeans, usually immigration was diverse. It came in manageable numbers, and it was mostly legal, and the people came with some skills, not all, but that made assimilation and integration much easier. But when you have 55 million people and 16% of the population, and you have enclave, that makes it much more difficult to assimilate, especially if we, the host, doesn't really believe in assimilation and doesn't feel that we're enriched just on the core, but the very essence of the American experiment might be changed as well, and that would be considered a good thing. You can really see it when Ronald Reagan signed the Simpson-Mazzoli Act of 1986 that offered a blanket amnesty for, I think it was 2.5 million people who had been here illegally. What was rarely remarked on, I think only about 35% chose to exercise that amnesty in terms of pathways to citizenships. In other words, they were issued a green card and they were happy with that. And I live in a community that's about 95% Hispanic, probably 40% people have suggested are here illegally. And when you talk about people of an older generation, and I try to do this a lot, were you amnestied under Simpson-Mazzoli? And they say yes. And then the next question is, did you apply for citizenship? They said no. And the next question is, why didn't you? And they said there was no definable benefit that they could see. Their children, under an interpretation of amendments to the Constitution, would be citizens if they were born to parents here illegally. And they didn't see anything they couldn't do that a citizen couldn't do. So it was, for them, it was just a kind of a headache to go through the process. There's other things. I would call this challenge of tribalism, or the peasantry, the rise of peasantry in exchange for a middle class, or the idea of the conflation of residency versus citizenship. It's kind of a pre-modern phenomenon. It happens in pre-state societies where people come and go. There's no defined borders. There is no autonomous landowning, legally protected middle class, and people are unsure whether a person is a citizen or resident, and they can't see any advantage to either status. Kind of like in the Roman Empire when Caracalla in 212 gave mass citizenship, partly because the number of people in the provinces of the Roman Empire, he did it for tax purposes, to collect taxes, but there was a larger number of people who were not official Roman citizens, and it was unworkable. And so in a kind of a blanket amnesty, he thought that he could incorporate everybody, but that really didn't solve the problem of bringing different people, different languages, different ethnicities, and not being able to inculcate them, assimilate them, and integrate them in the tradition of Italian agrarianism and Roman republicanism of a lost age. There is, though, another move on the other end of the spectrum to diminish citizenship. I'd call that the postmodern effort, not the pre-modern natural phenomenon, that this is more of a contrived, deliberate effort. One of them is, I would call them the evolutionaries, the evolutionary movement. They feel that human nature changes, maybe technology or diet or improved material conditions, and that we're just different people, that we're not this, we don't embrace the tragic view that human nature is constant against time and space, and therefore they feel the Constitution is ossified, calcified. Even the amendment process of requiring 2/3 of Congress and 3/4 of the states is too clumsy and laborious, and therefore they want to make radical changes in the Constitution to change the essence of Americanism. You can see it with the effort of the National Voter Popular Compact. In other words, they feel they don't really look at the arguments for the Electoral College, and I'll be happy to make them as gleaned from the Federalist Papers and other contemporary documents at the signing, but they understand the evolutionaries don't have the number of votes necessary to do that. So they've gone to each of the individual state legislatures and said, would you pass a law, it must be unconstitutional, that says you will reflect the national vote and not your state total. And now we're only 61 votes short. In other words, 18 states have signed that compact. It's kind of ironic that nobody wants to jump the gun until they get 270. In other words, New York or Illinois or California on Tuesday didn't say, you know what, we signed the National Voter Compact, therefore we're not going to pledge our electors to Donald Trump. Excuse me, we're not going to pledge them to Kamala Harris because she didn't win the national vote. Donald Trump did. So we're going to nullify the California, Illinois, or New York voting. But that's what the National Compact says. But apparently it won't take place until they get the next 61 votes and get around outlawing or destroying the Electoral College. Another thing is we've had a filibuster. You can read the arguments about it. It's been widely discussed for about 180 years. It came in the 1820s. 1830s. And the idea was consistent with a bicameral legislature, that the states would be represented qua states in the Senate, even though the founders, first they were appointed senators by the legislature, but then by the popular vote. And the idea was this would be sort of like the upper Gerousia in Sparta or the Senate in Rome, and they would slow down the tribal assemblies or the assemblies in the House of Representatives. So if you had a popular fad or movement, you would have time to digest it in the Senate, because these people were representatives of an entire state, not just members of the people, that their representation in the grassroots sense would happen in the House. And therefore, California, for example, it's about 20 million people of us. We have one senator per 20 million, and Wyoming has about 250,000. We get angry about that, but it's consistent with the idea of the Constitution that Wyoming is an entity that's unique and particular and deserves representation. Of course, it goes back to selling the Constitution in part to states rather than just to residents. And that is under attack. So the idea of senators should be popularly elected, that's a very popular topic in law reviews, for example, as is getting rid of the Senate filibuster. And usually what happens in America, the minority party, whether Republican or Democrat, but more often Democrat because they are more evolutionary, believes that the filibuster is unfair. Barack Obama, for example, said it was a racist relic of Jim Crow. But when that party becomes, and he actually, he said that when he was in the majority, and of course, when he was in the minority, he filibustered out the Alito nomination. So now we have been told that we have to have the Senate filibuster. I have a feeling, not that I'm skeptical, but on January 20th, there will be no more talk of ending the Senate filibuster. The other thing was packing the court. It used to be kind of shameful, the 1937 Court Reorganization Act of FDR. His own party stopped it. They felt that it was a blatant manipulation to stop the new opposition to the New Deal. And from then on, it was kind of a disgrace. Now it's very popular. And we had Chuck Schumer, for example, saying that they wanted to have 15 justices, and they wanted to have mandatory ethics investigations and requirements, and they wanted to have term limits. But again, the problem with these evolutionary movements is they tend to be short-term and partisan. We haven't had anything other than a 9-person Supreme Court since 1869 for particular reasons, and that was that prior to 1869, about every other administration tried to pack the court and bring people of their political persuasion by adding to the court rather than the persuasion of justices or something. But we have seen, I don't think, again, after January 20th, there will be any movement in the next 4 years to pack the court. And if there is not a movement to continue to pack the court, then I think it illustrates the fact that the proposal was misguided and was partisan. Finally, we've had a 50-state union for 60 years, and it kind of was a practice. It was when it was possible, 2 states were often admitted, getting back to the 1830s in contentious years of slave, non-slave. states under the guise of the Great Compromise or Missouri Compromise as well. And that was sort of the idea, if you go back and look at the debate over Hawaii and Alaska in 1960, that Alaska was considered a conservative state and Hawaii was considered a liberal state. Neither party would benefit. But there has been a lot of calls to bring in Puerto Rico and amend the Constitution so that Washington, D.C. would not have its special federal status, but would actually be a state, and therefore you would have 4 senators immediately of one party. Again, that's an evolutionary idea, and you can see where that's going to lead, that there would be a movement, if that were to happen, to break up states. You can make the argument that California above Napa Valley and in the Sierra is a very distinct political culture. I live in Fresno County where I'm speaking, and Fresno County actually voted for Trump. And so did Tulare County, so did Kings County. So if you were to divide California, that would be a blatant political move to have 2 states and get 2 extra senators who would be conservative. Either party would do that. So there is some value then slowing things down and respecting a 50-state unit. These are just a few examples of what I think are threats to citizenship, and that is changing the system. And I don't mean just the Constitution, but long accepted protocols. And often they're necessary, and that's why we have an amendment process, such as the 18-year-old vote or civil rights action or suffrage. But these quick ideas to change something that has worked and try to avoid the normal process of amendments, very dangerous. Another thing we have a threat to citizenship is, I would call them the unelected. We have about 3 million people who are in some way working for the federal government, more with state government. And we are creating vast bureaucracies, often geographically fixed between New York and Washington, that operate as, I guess I could use the crude term, judge, jury, and executioner. By that I mean they have legislative, judicial, and executive power. And often they have mastered the intricacies of their bureaucracy, and they have enormous resources in the judicial system, paid lawyers, etc., that they act without legislative intent. I'll give you just 2 examples from practical, and I discuss these more in the book, but from practical experience. I don't know if you knew, but the obscure idea of making raisins from grapes, the raisin industry, there's about 5,000 growers. In the Depression, the price got down to $25 a ton, so the government came in and regulated the supply of raisins. And they did that by saying that they passed a law saying that they owned the grapes on the vine. And so if you were a farmer and you cut your own grapes, and then you dried them on the ground and you made them into raisins, you didn't own those raisins. The government came in and said to you, you're required, and that's still the law, you have to bring them to an authorized raisin packer, store them, and then a government investigator or auditor will look how many tons that are in the industry at these various yards. Then they will adjudicate what they think the market in the United States can handle, and they will declare it free tonnage, maybe 60%, and you will only be paid on that 60%. You cannot withhold your reserve tonnage. The reserve tonnage then will be made into brandy or cattle feed or given to Food for Peace or given overseas, and usually for pennies on the dollar. And that way, the market is artificially kept at a high price. We've had a lot of entrepreneurial farmers who've challenged that, and they have been slapped down, broke. The government has come in, confiscated their crops, ruled that the National Raisin Act of 1937 was constitutional, and it's still being adjudicated. Another example, just one very quickly, is the Inland Waterways Act. The Congress passed a law that said that the government shall have the right to make sure that our natural inland waterways are free of excessive levels of nitrogen. It was a well-intended law so that people who lived on the shores of major rivers would not fertilize in a reckless manner, and then rains would bring the nitrogen content of these interstate is what I'm trying to emphasize, waterways, so the federal government could adjudicate the high levels of nitrogen. But the people who passed that law became experts in it in the Environmental Protection Agency and the California state. So now they have decided that if you have a depression on your property and after a rain, that pond can be an interstate waterway, intrastate. And literally where I'm speaking, I have neighbors that have and I have a pond on my farm as well. But the government has the right to come in after a rain or after several rains, go onto your private property and take a sample, even though that was not the intent of the wall. There's no commercial value of that water body. It's not a navigable body, but they have. And who interpreted that? The bureaucracy itself did. And then if you try to oppose it, they have unlimited judicial resources. And everybody that I know who's challenged that has failed because of the ability of cherry picking judges. Again, it's an example of people who are not elected. I'll give you one more example. Whatever your views are on the FBI, it is strange that the former director of the FBI, Robert Mueller, testified under oath to the House Intelligence Committee that the two catalysts for his special appointment were the information in the Steele dossier and the information that was transmitted about that dossier through Fusion Glenn Simpson and Fusion GPS. He testified under oath he had no idea what the Steele dossier was or what Fusion GPS. That's demonstrably impossible. And yet he testified under oath. His successor, James Comey, was asked similar questions about the dossier and the FBI's involvement in both Hillary Clinton's case and Donald Trump's. He said under oath 245 times he could not remember. The next successive interim FBI director was Andrew McCabe. He admitted that he lied on 4 separate occasions under oath to federal investigators. And of course, the final one was Christopher Wray, when he was asked directly, why did the FBI have possession of Hunter Biden's laptop for over a year and had already adjudicated it to be authentic? Why wasn't that information released when it was a bone of contention right before the 2020 election? And more germanely, why did 11 FBI agents work with social medias, particularly Facebook and Twitter, to suppress news accounts and not allow them to be trafficked on these social websites that correctly had diagnosed that the laptop was genuine? Just an example, if you have 4 directors of the FBI and they feel with impunity they can lie under oath, and there's no redress because of their position and the DOJ. So it's another argument that the concentration of government power tends to conflate judiciary, executive, and legislative power in unelected people's hands. Finally, there's this challenge, a postmodern challenge of citizenship is cosmopolitanism. That's a fancy word from Greek, that you're a polites of the cosmos. You're a citizen of the world, rather a citizen of a particular country. That term, I think the first time it comes up is reference to Socrates, well after, I think it was in Diogenes Laertes or somewhere like that, where Socrates is reportedly saying, I'm not an Athenian, I'm a citizen of the world. And it tends to be an elite fixation that you have evolved to a certain point that you're no longer parochial. It involves a lot of corollaries. You don't really believe in a sovereign border. You believe that the southern border really doesn't really exist. It's a 19th century construct because people are people and they should have a right to go wherever they want. And after all, we have no more allegiance to the United States than we do to the world at large. You can see it manifested, say in Davos. A lot of people in Davos passed a resolution not too long ago that they were very critical of Ireland because Ireland had offered corporate incentives at a lower rate than other EU countries. And the people at Davos had really lobbied the EU to stop that. In other words, that the citizens of Ireland should not have sovereignty over their own tax policies and protocols, but they should subject that to an international body, or more germanely, the EU itself. We saw that during the Afghan war, where there were people in the International Criminal Court who suggested that if you were an officer in Afghanistan, that you would be subject to international criminal penalties if you ordered, say, an artillery strike that hit civilians. Or you saw the International Criminal Court threatening to bring to justice members of the Israeli government in Gaza. You saw that after the George Floyd riots and destruction, when members of the United Nations Commission on Human Rights, which at one time had as members North Korea, Iran, Venezuela, I think Venezuela still was, Cuba, and they were asked by Secretary Blinken to come in the United States and investigate charges that we were guilty of systemic racism. We saw it with the Paris Climate Accords, which was a treaty, but we bypassed that treaty, and we were basically rendering our sovereignty to this international group that would adjudicate to what degree we had met or missed our carbon emission reduction standards. But it's very dangerous, because it assumes that the more people you have, or the more people from different countries, therefore there's some innate wisdom, or there's a superior morality. When you look at the 188 nations in the world, and I think you can make the argument the United States Constitution is the oldest of all constitutional societies, and it guarantees the greatest protection of freedom and liberty. And to somehow outsource the application of freedom as defined economically, socially, culturally, politically, to a non-elected international body, it doesn't seem to be, it really strikes at the heart of citizenship. So in conclusion, I thought I would suggest that the citizen as we know it today is under assault by historic forces of non-integration, tribalism, identification with the natural impulses of all of us to seek affinity with people who look like we are, worship like we are, rather than to give our primary allegiance to a more abstract commonwealth. We have to be very careful that we're not turning into a binary society. I think California is one of the reasons people are leaving in droves, 270,000 a year, is it's deemed to be increasingly a medieval society where 21% of the population lives below the poverty line. The highest, actually more than Appalachia. 1 out of every 3 people on federal assistance live in California. And then we have the highest number of billionaires and the wealthiest zip code per capita at the same time, but not so much in terms of power, gasoline, prices of electricity, power, housing. They're not conducive to a vibrant and large middle class. And then finally, there is a trend in the United States to diminish the exclusivity of citizenship to the point now, I think in a state like California, which has the highest number of foreign-born, we have no idea how many people are citizens or not citizens, but more importantly, we don't seem to care. We don't think either we, the host of people who come to our country, should demand people become citizens or become legally. And more importantly, the people here who are not citizens are not convinced by their hosts that there's any substantial differences from being a legal or illegal resident and a citizen. They don't see the value or the effort to become a citizen because the traditional privileges and responsibilities of citizenship have been so diminished. And with that, I'll open it up to questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Victor. That was very interesting. We have a few questions, and I would like to ask the participants to try to be concise. So I expect there to be a lot of questions. So if you can ask your question concisely, I would appreciate it. So Rick is the first, and then Deirdre, and then David.
Thank you very much. You've covered an enormous amount of territory and raised a lot of very deep and significant questions. I guess I'm trying to get a picture of where pluralism fits into your conception, cultural and religious pluralism, for example. And when I think of the modern nation state, they come in different kinds. When I think of Europe, it seems to me they've accommodated tribalism by creating ethno-national entities in which citizenship is Sweden for the Swedes and Denmark for the Danes and Hungary for the Hungarians. So you basically end up having a relatively homogeneous population sharing cultural values, conceptions of family life, of gender, of authority and religion and so forth. So that simply recreates tribalism, it seems to me, by having an ethno-national entity and redefining citizenship that way. In a civic national environment like the United States, where, let's say, constitutional patriotism is what defines you as a citizen, or is what it means to be an American, an enormous amount of room is given by having a relatively weak notion of what's implied by citizenship. So divided we stand is what Thomas Jefferson invokes when it comes to religion. We don't require that if you're a citizen, here's the religion you should have, or here's the particular set of beliefs you should have. And in that case, it seems to me room is being made for tribalism. The conception I hear you putting out is basically a world of the state and individuals with all of the intermediary organizations that allow a ethical tradition to have thickness to it and be carried forward. And so where is the room for pluralism in your conception?
Well, I think you might have misinterpreted what I said. What I was talking about was within the parameters of citizenship, people have certain rights and responsibilities. And if you don't have most of your residents as citizens and they feel they're not subject because of their tribal affiliations to the common laws and statutes and protocols, traditions of the country, then you almost get apartheid side. So if you have people, for example, who come from the Middle East and they feel more comfortable by becoming green card holders, and they feel that in their community it's perfectly fine to voice anti-Semitic activity or to shun people based on their religion, and you feel that they have a separate community or that child marriage, I'm not picking on any particular group, but they have separate protocols and characteristics and traditions that are not subject to the majority, and they're a separate resident community, and they should be immune from the requires of responsibilities and citizenship, then you're kind of creating an apartheid society. You see that in Europe. You mentioned Europe, but anybody who goes, as you know, to Rotterdam or Paris and the outer boroughs or almost Sweden, you see an entire subset of the population that are not citizens, but they're resident aliens. And there are districts where you're right about the ethno state, but the ethno state is defined by we don't have the ability or the desire or the capability to assimilate these immigrants into the body politic of being French or being Dutch or being Swedish. And therefore, we're going to set aside almost like reservations where they can live and have a separate existence on the hope or the expectation that the sheer power of popular culture will, by osmosis, eventually by the third generation, turn them into, by language and culture, into a Swede or a Parisian or a Dutch. And that's not been that.
So you want to reject the image that was once there of the United States as a world federation of nations is something you would reject. You don't want there to be birds of a feather flocking together, having their right of association also imply a right to disassociate from others. You want
it's a matter of degree. So
I agree with that, but I mean,
the largest.
How weak can the citizenship be and still satisfy your notion of the ideal society?
It's a matter of degree, and it's a matter of interpretation. I mean, when you had 7 million Germans that were speaking German and not English, and they demanded in the Civil War the Union Army have General Siegel because he was German, and Lincoln did that, then you're getting to the border where it's problematic. If you have large groups of people who are not speaking the dominant language and they have not assimilated or acculturated to the protocols of the United States, and they have very little in common, at least for a couple of generations, with the majority population, and they are told or they're instructed in classes that that's a good thing, that tribalism is a good thing in a multiracial, multicultural society, it's not going to be viable. It's not.
Well, the final point, I'll go on to let others go. But I mean, I thought it was rather fascinating. I'm told that the first published copy of the Declaration of Independence was in a German-speaking newspaper in Philadelphia. And a huge part of the population involved were German speakers at that time. I mean, we don't have a national language. That's one of the things that's actually interesting about the United States. We don't have a federally declared language. We allow a lot of diversity with regard to language.
But there was the expectation that that phenomenon would last 2 or 3 generations at most. Maybe it still will, but we're starting to see multi-generation, and the difference in those times were from the beginning to Teddy Roosevelt, who spoke about it commonly from the bully pulpit. That was not a viable idea that you were going to bring in different groups of people in the United States and they would form permanent enclaves where they would have their own language and their own allegiances first to their own culture and their own politics, and they would vote perpetually and uniformly. The idea was that these were all going to be temporary phenomena that would be broken down by the government and also by popular culture. Again, it's not infringing on the person's right of dress, fashion, music, food, but it was the idea that as a civic matter, they would fully accept the protocols of being an American as rapidly as possible. That was
whatever those might be.
Whatever those might be.
How thin do you want them to be? How numerous or well, I'm sorry, I don't want to take up more time. Others may have questions.
Okay, thank you. Next question.
Yeah, I approve of the comments of my old friend Rick, and I don't much approve of yours, I must say.
That's fine.
I wonder why, to be sort of fundamental about it, why assimilation is such a grand idea, and furthermore, in a kind of smaller way, I wonder why the present configuration of things called countries is the optimal scale for this thing you call a commonwealth. It seems to me actually that the very notion of a commonwealth causes the kind of absurd regulations about making raisins that you properly attack, and if such commonwealths are a grand idea, why shouldn't I don't know, Massachusetts be a commonwealth and have tariffs and citizenship checks and so forth? It seems accidental that.
I don't think it was at all. I think that was the genius of the founders. They understood exactly what you're talking about. And so they had a grand compromise under federalism that each state would have particular rights and responsibilities that they would not be given up in the Constitution, especially the Bill of Rights, that all powers would be reserved to the state. They would have unique cultures within the state, but their primary allegiance would be to the federal government. And any time that was challenged on nullification, the government was, I think, in the right. South Carolina decided that tariffs over the tariff question, that federal law would not apply. And the Civil War during the southern states said, and we're starting to see, by the way, that nullification of commonwealths already. We have 600 jurisdictions right now that says the federal government does not have a right, I think it's unconstitutional, to go into a particular jurisdiction and detain a person who violates federal immigration law or the criminal code and deport them. The problem with this is that's an evolutionary concept. So you have people now that are talking in Utah and say, well, if you have sanctuary jurisdictions, 600 of them, we don't really believe the federal government has a right to tell us that we can't go into a store and buy a revolver. Utah has no problem with that. So we're going to nullify federal law. Then you have people in Wyoming who say, you know what, I'm building a development. And the federal government has come in and says they have a Federal Endangered Species Act, and there's a two-spotted toad on my lot. And the government of Wyoming has no problem with that. So I'm going to destroy this crazy newt or lizard and build my building. And the government has said no. When state laws contravene federal laws, the federal law predominates, at least as matter between interstate commerce and things. So, and that's a very good system because it vents what you're talking about: local control, state control, fear of a tyranny of a federal government. But for purposes of national defense or interstate commerce, we've had 237 years of compromise, and it's worked pretty well. And anytime anybody's tried to err on one side or the other, and I tried to give examples of an overweening federal government, CIA, FBI, or an overwhelming state government, it doesn't work very well. And one of the things that holds us all together is when we have immigrants and people of different religions and different ethnic groups, we have said to them, if you want to speak at home in your language that enriches you, that's wonderful. But for practical purposes, we need a common language. Maybe we haven't done it by statute, but we always tried to make sure that people spoke a common language, they had a common culture, they had a common tradition, and therefore they could interrelate to people as Americans rather than as Swedes or Californians or people from Massachusetts. And I think the system works well because it's the longest surviving constitutional system in the world today.
I don't want to be assimilated.
Well, you are assimilated if you know it or not. You're speaking a language that most people speak. And I haven't, the first thing you didn't say as a English woman or as a Swede or as a German. My students at Cal State Fresno would say to me, I don't really want to talk about the Iliad because as a Latino, it's not germane to me. And I would say it's germane to anybody who's human.
I agree with on that.
Yeah. Yeah. So I don't think you haven't self-identified it by your ethnic group. You haven't said to me as a Christian, you're not speaking German to me. So I think you're pretty well assimilated to the body politic.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Me, David?
Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks, Victor.
David.
Two interesting historical things, and you can correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah.
But the Hawaii-Alaska thing was the exact opposite. Apparently, at the time, Alaska was Democratic and Hawaii was Republican, and so they brought him in that way.
Yeah.
The second thing, more serious about history, before I get to my real question, my understanding is one main reason they went to the Electoral College was they wanted to kind of rein in the power of Virginia, which was kind of like the California of the time. Is that correct?
The power of what? I didn't hear that last word.
The power of Virginia.
Virginia.
Which is kind of the California of its time.
That was one of the reasons that wasn't official. That was a subtext. But the official reason, at least as they're outlined in the Federalist Papers, were things that we really don't appreciate. One of them was they felt that they were worried about ballot integrity. And they felt that if people in Washington were able to fix a national ballot, they could swing an election. But where they had the Electoral College, there were so many states that it was very hard to, in a conspiratorial fashion, get control of all these sort of highly eccentric individual states on the same page. That was one thing. And they have it in the Constitution. Balloting shall be the primary responsibility of the state, except from time to time the federal government can step in, and that's things like the suffrage. The other thing they felt was, and Jefferson said that, of course, he was that there were certain value of rural people, that 95% of people at the time were rural, and they were looking at increasing urban populations in Boston, Philadelphia, New York, and they felt that they were developing a culture that was at odds with the people who'd fought in the Revolution. And more importantly, they felt there were certain things that made the United States go besides commerce, and that was things like food, agriculture, timber, mining, and that those representatives of those industries and those activities were very important. And if they didn't have the Electoral College, then candidates would go into the cities alone and they get a false picture. And I guess translated into modern terms, we wouldn't, I think we've all noticed, especially recently with the red-blue state, when we watch election turns Tuesday night, it was very hard to find the popular vote. They didn't even list it. They just looked at individual states, and candidates were going to Pennsylvania, they were going to Arizona, they were going to Michigan. They weren't going to California. They weren't going. I felt kind of underrepresented as a rural California, but my state, I think if we did not have the Electoral College, you would basically be campaigning in Los Angeles, San Francisco, Houston, New York, Chicago, and you would get a very different view of very important livelihoods and pursuits of what makes up this diverse country.
Right. So my question I wanted to get to,
Yeah.
and it's not a gotcha, but I'm trying to explore the limits of what you said.
Yeah.
So you were very much against the ICC, the International Criminal Court.
Yeah.
And I get it. I get it. But we did have the Nuremberg Court after World War II. Now, those were extreme compared to what we're talking about now. So I'm trying to just figure out, is that, first of all, would you have favored the Nuremberg Court? And if so, would you say there could be circumstances under which we'd want the ICC?
Well, got to remember that the League of Nations had become defunct. Its documents were in suspension, and they would be handed over to what would become the United Nations. But there was not, there were the allies. They called them the United Nations. Those were the allies. But there wasn't a formal, as happened at San Francisco Foundation. So that was not an international court. That was a court of the winners. And it suffered from the same criticism after the Versailles Treaty of 1919, when everybody came, Wilson and everybody, and Clemenceau, David Lloyd George, they came into Versailles in January. They didn't finish till July, and they decided the war guilt clause. They decided as winners what the indemnity would be and reparations and all of that. And after that occurrence, actually, if you look at what the Nuremberg Court was about and the Allies' activity of occupying Germany, it was often reaction to the Versailles Treaty, but in a critical fashion. They felt that the Versailles Treaty had done the worst of both things. They had lectured to people from kind of a multinational perspective, but they had been weak in enforcing it. They said to themselves, we're going to occupy Germany, we're going to say that they were culpable, and we're going to try people, and we're going to enforce it. And we ended up dividing Germany. And that was part of it. What I'm trying to say is trying particular people in the German government especially. Did I agree with all of it? No, because there were people in the German military that are reprehensible, but there were a few that General Wallenmart and others were not war criminals. I don't know what would have happened to, some of them didn't engage with Operation Valkyrie and Stauffenberg, but they did oppose Hitler, and they were not in positions where they carried out commissar orders of executing Jews, or they still were culpable fighting for a terrible cause. But when you have Soviet justices, and that happened, sentencing some of these people to death when they were responsible for killing over 20,000 Polish officers in the Katyn Forest, or 20 million people in the Great Terror, it was very problematic. But by and large, when you look back at the Nuremberg trials, and you look at the architects of the Holocaust, or the people who really promulgated the 65 million people who died in World War II, they did a lot better job than you would think at the outset. Some of the things they did to Japanese generals that conquer General Hama and Yashima, they were very fierce, tough guys, and their people died, but they weren't quite, and we hung them. I mean, Tojo was a bad guy, so he tried to kill himself. We went in and had emergency surgery, saved his life from severe stomach wounds, let him recuperate for 6 months, and then tried him and hung him. And
But so you wouldn't in principle be against an international criminal court. The question is the use of it.
yes, I think what I would say is if you want an international criminal court, you would have to have some requisites for membership.
Okay.
And that would mean that your country have to have a constitutional system. And then I think what I'm trying to get at rather clumsily is something like the Geneva Accords on behavior in war. And those were really founded in the 1920s after World War I. And the idea was the democracies, their constitutional government would consider this was barbaric and you couldn't use poison gas. And they actually kind of worked, except for the Japanese. Nobody used poison gas on a wide scale during World War II. I think that was a good thing. But if you that would be good for I think of the 180 something nations, we only have half of them are democracies or constitutional system. So you had these absurdities where they come in to New York and then they vote for the first and only time in their life. They're voting on a consensual system, and they're trying to exercise sovereignty over constitutional states, even though they're not from constitutional states and they don't believe in constitutional states. So Iran should never be a member of the Human Rights Commission.
Right. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
John Coker. Jonathan Burke.
I'm here.
Sorry,
Yeah.
you're here. Okay, John.
Sorry, I had to unmute myself. This was great. You combine three elements, and sometimes combining gives grand view, but sometimes it makes each element more fragile because if the other elements don't hold up when discrete. So as I see it, you combined a cri de coeur for the American middle class, a stunning denunciation of the authoritarian properties of our current left-wing administrative state, and then a sense of a whole business about immigration tied together with sort of the duties and rights of citizenship, but along with a bunch of other things. So as the administrative state taking over and becoming authoritarian, I could not agree with you more. The cri de coeur of the middle class, I'm a little more doubtful of. So just you cited some facts, which I'll disagree with.
Yeah.
Earnings may not be up. Wages are up. Why? Because people of lower incomes in the US don't work. The labor force participation rate of the lowest quintile is 30%. Now, you painted a picture of they have become addicted to social programs. Marginal tax rate is 100% once you get involved with social programs. So that does not seem like a lack of jobs. Until the inflation came along, the wages available to people who wish to work have risen quite well in the US, and they're way better than they are in all of Europe, for example. So I think there's a problem with the lower class, not quite so clear that the middle class is suffering economically as much as you paint. And the second small one I'll disagree with is, you said a number one thing that a nation must do is control its borders and have passports. We didn't have passports before 1900. So you certainly want to fight crime, but that doesn't necessarily mean having a national database of everybody who comes in and goes in the borders. You want national security, but again, that doesn't necessarily involve the borders. Most people coming in are coming in because they want to, well, either visit or they want to work hard, pay taxes, and bail out our welfare state. So I think one can have a slightly gentler view of the necessity of course. And let me just start. The last one is the question of the nation state and its sanctity is a delicate one. The US we are a melting pot when we've been successful. Mostly, and here I'll echo a little bit, Deidre, most of these states are based on ethnic and cultural divisions, as you pointed out. But Sweden isn't for the Swedes and Denmark for the Danes. They're all part of the European Union. And this did not work out so great in Europe from about 1100 to the birth of the European Union. States based on ethnic, tribal, religious identity tend to have big wars against each other. And I think it's something of our special nature that we have a state based on a national identity but not the kinds of things like India, Pakistan, or internal identities like, as you mentioned, India or Lebanon. Not so organizing people around those principles doesn't seem like a great idea. So there's the three.
Well, I don't think you understood my last one. I was arguing against that I was suggesting that a national identity that transferred a tribal loyalty to a shared identity of people who were of different races, different religions, and different superficial appearances, and having that share and not emphasizing tribal differences made the United States successful, and that we don't want to go back to a tribalization. One of the things the founders, as you know, said that they were very worried about the North American continent because they felt that if the states were to fragment, then the paradigm they used was the local cultures and religions and ethnicities of Europe, which was about the same size as North America, but it had 30 different countries. And they said that would be a prescription for perpetual war. That was used against the Civil War in particular. So I was arguing, maybe I wasn't clear about it, that we do not want separate fiefdoms of people congregating by these affinities of race or ethnic background or particular languages without sharing a common identity that's national. As far as the middle class, I'm not sure what your argument was about the poor, but I think when you look at the symptoms of the middle class, and correct me if I'm wrong, I think there had been a stagnation in middle class wages until 2017 for 12 years. At least that was what was championed by the Congressional Tax Reduction Act of 2017. And then when you do look at the symptoms about home ownership, it's gone down a little bit. It hasn't gone up as everybody had forecast. If you look at the size of families, they've gone down. If you look at the marriage rate, they've gone down. If you look at the student loan obligations, it's gone up. So you get the impression that this generation, I know that's stereotyped in the media, but you do get the impression that the average American, not the wealthy or the poor, has more difficulty rather than less buying a home, feels, maybe wrongly, according to your data, but nevertheless feels that it can't afford as many children as it might like. It feels that it has student debt, that it's crippling its economic opportunity, and it doesn't seem to be as confident and viable, as, at least that's the perception. And that's what politics is kind of geared toward.
You know, you're right about the perception. Home.
Yeah, and the other thing very quickly about passports, that's true too, but mostly when you talk about we didn't have clearly defined borders, it was a matter of population density and provinces and areas that were not yet states, and so territories. So from 1800 to 1900, people really weren't even sure where the Mexican border was. They had a general idea what Rio Grande, but where the Rio Grande stopped, say in California or Arizona, they didn't know exactly where the border was, or that it wasn't really a pressing concern because there was not large numbers of immigrants coming en masse to settle. And when there was, they addressed that at Ellis Islands because mostly people were coming transoceanically. And so that they did have, once that started, they realized they did need some type of passport control, because we're not talking about, 100,000 people that were cattle ranchers or farmers or traders going back and forth across, or outlaws. They were talking about massive numbers of people coming from particular places in Ireland or Germany and Eastern Europe, and they wanted very much to know how many were coming. They wanted to know where they were coming, and they wanted to make sure that they would assimilate as rapidly as possible into the body politic. And that was a big...
Last little thing you said, fertility has been collapsing everywhere. It's not unique to America. In fact, we're doing better than most other places. So that's a global phenomenon.
I'm not suggesting this is, I think it's a Western phenomenon, the collapse of fertility, and I think it has something to do in the two worst countries, as you know, are not even Germany, it's South Korea. And a lot of that is, when you read the literature about South Korea, there's a perception that the middle class is almost, it's squeezed more than here as far as their ability to buy a home or to buy 2 cars or to do things that they thought in the past. But anyway.
We continue.
Yes. Next, do you have time for a couple more questions, if there is any?
Yeah, Victor, thank you very much for coming.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for coming. I'm going to take a very different perspective. Let me ask you this big, broad question. What's wrong? I mean, America is the most successful nation on earth. I don't think anybody could dispute that fact. It is, and I think most people would say it's precisely the immigration policy the country followed. It's precisely the melting pot that resulted in the huge success of the country. I don't see much different now to past immigration waves. I mean, you're an expert. I'm not the expert, but as far as I know, I think the 20s or whatever, there was a huge reaction against immigration that shut down immigration for a very long time in response to too much immigration coming in. But those immigrants were all well assimilated into the country. And, why are we concerned that, again, we're going to get a reaction now? We're going to stop the immigration, but I don't see any real concern that we have lost our ability to assimilate people into the American culture and that, do what made this country so successful.
Well, it depends on where you live. In some areas, you're correct. I suggest if you come to the southern Fresno County, you might have a different interpretation.
Well, how's that different to Brooklyn?
Brooklyn, I think you're conflating illegal and legal immigration. Part of the reason that I think illegal immigration represents a challenge is that legal immigration is what, as you say, has made America really astounding. And we want legal immigration. In fact, I don't see any problem with letting in 1 million people legally. But when you put constraints on legal immigration, and a legal immigrant, say he's coming from the Punjab and he wants to farm 80 acres with his uncle, and it takes him 8 years to get through the immigration process, and then he says, people just walked over the border, that person was a felon in Mexico or Venezuela, here they are, there's no, you don't know who they are, but yet we have a very diverse way we look at legal immigration and illegal immigration. We punish the legal immigrant. We ask them to be self-supporting in many cases. We want to know what their skills are to get a green card, and we have absolutely no adjudication. We have 350,000 people here that are known felons. We don't know where they are. And does it make a difference? Yeah, I live in a very rural area, I don't like to do anecdote, but I grew up in an area that was always about 75% Mexican-American. Most people were first generation. They came legally. It was a wonderful place. Assimilation took usually 2 or 3 generations. That generation I grew up with basically are the police, the city councilmen. They are the critics of the current system. They cannot believe what is happening. We have 5,000 people that came en masse. And you have a very different view when you walk out in your orchard and you find a corpse in your orchard and no one knows who the corpse is. And that's, or you look across the street and you see 55 people living across the street from you in 2 houses, and you ask the county, or what happened to registration about dog licensing, or what happened about building codes or cesspools when there's open pits for sewage, and they'll tell you, we have no idea who's living there. We don't want to know. All we know is some people are Sureños and some people are Norteños, and we don't want to get in the middle. And so we have large enclave. Mendota, California is a good example. The Mexican-American community asked for federal protection because M13 had taken over the town, and most of the people in it were here illegally. So all I'm arguing for is we're enriched by immigration. I'm a big pro-legal immigration person. I think we could even expand it. Some of the thing that keeps America working is we get all of these talented immigrants. But when you let in, for example, 12 million people within 3.5 years from the poorest regions in the country, and you have no background check, You have no idea who's coming in. You have no ability to assimilate them. And you have a large segment of the intelligentsia that will tell these new people that they are somehow victimized, or there's not a necessity to understand the protocols of American citizenship or civic education. Then you have a problem, and that's what's happened. Do I think it's permanent? No. I think we're going through this period that we've had some similarities in the past, and each time we've dealt with them. Does it create xenophobia that's unfortunate? Yes. But what's unusual about what we're watching now, and you saw that in the last election, is the primary opposition to illegal immigration south of the border is coming from predominantly Hispanic communities. Why is that? Because they will tell you that it took them 7 weeks to get their mother on dialysis and have the government pay for it. And suddenly when they go to the dialysis clinic, there's 20 people there who she can't get, the social services are inundated. Or they go to their school, and if their son does not speak Spanish anymore, somebody tells them that he's a gringo, and if they get in a fight, that person will tell them that Norteños is going to be meeting them after school. So you have a huge, we've never done this before. We've never had 16% of the population foreign born. Maybe it's good. Maybe we'll find out. But so far, I think the electorate feels that illegal immigration, except to the economy, was the #2 concern that they all have. And they were not talking about legal immigration. They were talking about massive illegal immigration. They weren't talking about illegal immigration of 100 or 150,000 in the past. They were talking about 12 million people and 10 to 20,000 people per day. And they felt that it eroded the exclusivity of citizenship. And these people who felt that way were not Anglo-Saxon, white, affluent, or all. They were lower and middle-class Hispanic people. And they felt that it was injurious to their visions of upward mobility. And they felt kind of deprived, that they felt they had played by the rules and gone through all the hoops to get green cards, and that suddenly you could fly in from Oaxaca or Chiapas or Michoacan to Fresno, and you could get on social welfare systems, and they had no idea whether the person they met at the dialysis clinic was a felon, was escaping a cartel. They had no idea, and they had not been treated that way themselves. They had been told there were rules and regulations that they followed. And so this was a grassroots. It didn't come from. In fact, I could make the further argument that the elite in the country, the corporate elite especially, was for open borders. That was what was the fun. The wealthy, by income, if you look at the polls, the wealthier people are, the more they are in favor of illegal immigration. The less wealthy, and the more that they feel precarious on the economic ladder. And it's not just xenophobia or paranoia. That's what the inner city of Chicago, I mean, one of the reasons that in this last election, 17% of African Americans, but African American males, 26%. It was a feeling that the federal government was privileging people in a way that they felt was unfair to the citizen. And that's where I think that, but I don't, if I misled you and suggested I was opposed to legal immigration, I think that one of the reasons California survives all of its self-inflicted wounds is it's able to attract a lot of very capable, industrious people of all classes from all over the world legally. The other thing is, psychologically, once a person comes across the border illegally and feels there was no consequences, then the next step that you can reside illegally becomes natural. Then the third step is to, if you come in illegally, the law was nullified for you, the resident law was nullified. Then the third aspect is identification. So you can get identification. And what are we going to do now, as I was just reminded by a lot of my Mexican-American friends, by our upgraded license, a real ID that everybody had to get in line, and you had to show not just your license, but a passport or birth certificate and a residency of California to get a bear stamped on your license so you could fly. Federal government says that you have to have that. And yet people who are coming illegally in Tucson, if you go to the Phoenix airport, you will see a designation where a person comes illegally and they go right through without any identification. And that's strikes an American as unfair. And a lot of people in the millions felt so. And those were the issues that I think in a lot of cases determine the outcome of the election. And it wasn't demagoguery, and it wasn't xenophobia, it wasn't racism, it wasn't protectionism. It was a grassroots feel that the American citizen had no particular their own government didn't particularly favor them over a foreign national who had broken the law when they had abided by it. It was a fundamental issue of unfairness.
I agree with that.
Yeah.
I didn't. It seemed like you were conflating the two.
No, I'm not.
I agree. Illegal immigration we have to fix, but otherwise, the country depends on immigration,
and that's
especially
one of
with
the
the low
reasons
birth rates.
Yeah, one of the reasons I'm worried about illegal immigration is because people who are so affected by it, and I've had this argument with a lot of opponents of illegal immigration, then they want all immigration. They call it a timeout. And they say, well, until we fix it, let's just have no immigration. And I don't think that, from a selfish point of view, we have these talented people all over the world that feel they're either a misfit economically, culturally, politically in their own country, many of them, and they feel that the United States would allow them to develop in a way that they feel is in their interest, but in the interest of humanity. And we get all of these people, but why would we endanger that system by at the same time allowing 12 million people, some with criminal backgrounds, not the majority, but enough to be very worried about, or health backgrounds, and just let them come in illegally and then expect them to follow our laws and traditions when we don't even enforce the law. So that was the distinction. But I'm a big proponent of legal immigration, and at very high levels, 1 million a year. You have another question? I don't know if we have time.
Yes, there is a last question by Dan Plains.
Yeah.
Hi, thanks for everything. Everything you say resonates with me. You said something about the discussion of the Electoral College, and
Yes.
one point had to do with ballot integrity.
Yeah.
I know of other good arguments for the Electoral College, and I'm trying to understand this one, because the way it seems to work now is almost as though the Electoral College would give an incentive to cheat, let's say, that extra 100,000 votes in Arizona, because you get not just 100,000 votes, you get the whole 100% of the votes.
Yes.
So how does that work?
Well, the way that it's discussed in documents and I think it's in the Federalist Papers, but it's the founders were worried about it, that if there was a national effort to rig the vote and you did not have the Electoral College, you just went by the popular vote, and the federal government controlled all balloting, then it would be easier to do it all in one fell swoop. But when you outsourced the primary responsibility for making ballot rules, and that the electors would be chosen by the popular vote within the state, then there was less chance that states or the government could get together and affect the integrity of the voting. I'm not suggesting that maybe they were mistaken in the way they worked out in the modern era, that a large state could affect the national vote. And but that was the original intent, at least, that they thought that you couldn't rig the national, you could easier rig the national one-time vote than you could all of the states electing their electors in different.
That's actually more about administering the voting.
Yes.
It's about the Electoral College versus the percentages.
Yes. I think it was the idea of dividing up the responsibility into so many hands that it would be impossible to coordinate them in a conspiratorial fashion. I'm not suggesting that it's always worked out the way they envisioned, but that was one argument for it. The main argument was to appeal to Americans as members of a particular state, as well as being a citizen of a nation, and also the Jeffersonian argument that you wanted people to visit the frontier of the countryside. And there was something in Western civilization going back to Rome and Greece, an idealization or a romanization of yeomanry and independent homestead farmers, and that they were and I think there is something to that today about having diverse people by population density.
The other big argument for the Electoral College is, of course, just the fact that it's disproportionate and gives smaller states more sway, and
Yes.
that has other good elements
Yeah,
to it.
I think so. I mean, I'd like to see what's going on in Wyoming and Montana and Michigan and Pennsylvania, not just Los Angeles and New York and things like
It's
that.
harder to get thraldom throughout the country, like everywhere.
Yeah.
Like, yeah.
Yeah. I don't know if we have time for one more question.
Is there any other question?
I'll jump in and ask one. I'll jump in and ask one, actually. I just posted it in the chat, but thanks, Victor. This was great. I mean, it was a point that I actually was hoping maybe you could comment on, or others.
Yeah.
It was made earlier in the chat that, if you came here in the 1920s, you might have had to go work immediately in a factory, whereas today there are all kinds of government programs you can rely on. And it just seems like you're going to get very different citizens and likely very different degrees of assimilation in those two different settings. I mean, if you have to interact with the free market economy for your survival and your well-being versus just being able to depend on a welfare state, it seems arguably that people are much more likely to assimilate and develop more of a national identity when they have to interact with the economy as a whole for their well-being.
I could think you can see that in action, because the greatest proponents for legal immigration, or at least even if a person comes illegally, finding legal status to work, in my experience, I think the data shows that are Mexican American legal residents. They are the most opposed to illegal immigration, and even within their own families. But I think if you look at one of the reasons that California hasn't quite descended despite itself with its crazy policy is they're starting to develop a large class of Mexican American entrepreneurs, and they're legal, and they are becoming, maybe if not yet politically conservative, traditionally conservative about hard work. And when they come here and they see there's this opportunity, and the government programs, maybe they may have been on them or their brother is on them, but they're perpetual rather than temporary. And there's much more opportunity to get into the free market and be a roofer or concrete. But there's large swaths of the state I don't think we appreciate that for example, the trucking industry on the 99 freeway is estimated at 50% Punjabi. The carpentry or framing industry or drywall in Fresno County is about 90% Mexican American. And there's amazing entrepreneurialism. And the funny thing is, you're absolutely right. The more that people engage in free market activity, the more the confident they get, the more they become traditional, and they want legal only immigration. And they're worried their wages are undercut by illegal immigration, or people on welfare, or their services are curtailed by just the saturation of people coming in mass. So that's one thing that I think immigration is, if it's not subsidized, it's not illegal, it's wonderful, because it invigorates people. I know it does me when I see people working. I put a roof on my house, and I knew a guy who came here legally 20 years ago. He's impoverished, came out and asked for a job, and I remembered him. He said he did shingles. He employs 25 people, and he did my roof, and I talked to him for hours why that was happening, and all he gave me was your argument. There's nothing better than the United States, and we come here, we get to do what we want, we can make all the money we want. He said something that was it was very original, but I mean, it was really, he said, what I like about this country is everything's judged by money. And he was telling me that he's very wealthy, and the local school board wants him to run, and this local hospital board wants him on it. And he said he was born in Michoacan, but he has so much money now that he's got status. In other words, in the United States, status is not confined to your race. He's indigenous. He's from southern Mexico. And he spoke actually a language other than Spanish. His original language was Baja Mixteca. But the point he was making was, if you make money in the United States, you get status. And it doesn't matter who your parents are or birth. it's based on your own degree to make money. And he felt that that was, I guess he was trying to say to me, it was more of an equalizing phenomenon than being confined to Mexico, where you were judged by who your parents were, where you lived, or your complexion or whatever. But here in America, once you made money, then you were sought out and considered part of the establishment. So I
Do you
agree
have time
with
for
that.
one more question?
Yeah. Yeah.
Sorry. Do you have time for one more question,
Okay.
Victor? I wanted to ask you a quick question.
Yeah.
So you talk about tribalism and wokeness, seems to, I mean, the main agenda of wokeness seems to be this sort of identity politics and tribalism. And I don't know the reason for that. I presume many woke people on the left actually are deep believers in sort of identity politics, right? But some people also claim that this sort of tribalism is politically useful to the left, particularly if you combine the identity politics with a very loose immigration policy. But if you look at the result of the election, it would seem as though this sort of project completely failed, right? So rather than tribalism, what you see is the opposite, right? You see a sort of political depolarization. You see Latinos voting Republican more than ever, right? And so whatever demographic group you consider, what you see is the opposite of tribalism, right? There is this very strong trend towards the opposite. So do you agree with that? And what would you explain?
No, I agree. I agree entirely. DEI is an elite imposed phenomenon, top down, and assimilation, integration, intermarriage is bottom up. And it doesn't have to be this difficult, but it is because of this elite-driven DEI. And it's largely I see it's a phenomenon, an abstract phenomenon to reward people that are pretty much college educated and they're professionals. But it's not shared by the middle and lower classes to the same degree, and they are rejecting it in widespread popular. And that was what the election was about. That's why this election got people so angry on the left, because they felt, I was listening to Al Sharpton and Joe Scarborough discuss it, and they were almost racist and say they were blaming black males in the way that Obama did. What's wrong with these people? They're sexist. They wouldn't vote. They were just clueless that people might have class concerns that would transcend their racial or ethnic identity. And that's what's frightening, I think, to some on the left, that they see this trend now that people are saying, if you're a Mexican-American truck driver, or you're a so-called white electrician, or you're a black sales, a post office person, you have more in common with each other than you do a Silicon Valley elite or Al Sharpton or La Raza something. That's a very scary idea, that you substitute class interest rather than race. So I think I agree with you, that's very positive. The other thing that's making DEI wither is just the fact of intermarriage and artificial emphasis when people would not be able superficially to detect one's race or background. I'm not just talking about the extreme cases of Elizabeth Warren and her high cheekbones being the first Native American law professor at Harvard, or Ward Churchill, but in a real sense, in an intermarried society, and especially when we just dismiss class, and we have people from the upper classes who claim that they're 1/8 this or 1/6 this, and therefore they feel that they can tap into historic discrimination and repertory fashion, that they deserve special treatment, and yet superficially nobody can tell what they are anymore. And I think that's a good thing, intermarriage. I have one brother that was married to someone from Mexico, Mexican-American. I have another brother whose 2 children are half Mexican-American. And it was very funny to see in the same family children that didn't have a last name. If their name was Campos, middle name was Campos, their last name was Hansen, but 2 of the children felt that they could identify as Campos and the other 2 couldn't, the way that the university treated the 2, in other words, and yet they had the same background, the same parents and everything. But it's this emphasis on elite. I don't know if it's a psychological mechanism out of guilt, like a medieval phenomenon of penance, where in the abstract you're for all of this, and then you feel that therefore you're acceptable. But there's something about this DEI, especially among the white elites, that they're not, it's not coming from people who live next to minorities or intermarry with minorities. It's coming from that elite class of the left that impose it. And I think the people are starting for the first time to, as you suggest, rebel against it, partly for practical reasons. You can't, because we are not a systematically racist society and people are intermarrying at a record degree, and we're becoming that category of other or mixed race is almost larger than any one particular, especially in California where we don't have a majority of any particular race. These are ossified, calcified, reactionary concepts that no longer fit the demographics. So the future, I'm very confident. I just wish in the present we didn't make it so difficult on ourselves.
Okay, that was fantastic.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Victor.
Thank you,
everybody.
Thank you, everybody.